Hello, my name is Lee Osborne, and I'm the current chairman of the Forms Committee for both NEFAR and Real MLS. As such, I've been asked to go over again the recent changes to the NEFAR purchase and sale agreement. And I want to start by reminding everyone that this is an as-is contract, subject, of course, to the right of inspection and investigation, but otherwise it is an as-is contract. I want to start on page 1. And I want you to first look at both buyer and seller information. We have deleted marital status for both buyer and seller, but still recommend that you reflect, again, whether buyers are a married couple, whether they intend to be joint tenants with a right of survivorship, or tenants in common. The presumption, if no designation is given, is that the parties will take title as tenants in common. Please also use the names as they appear on their government-issued photo IDs. This will typically be a driver's license, and don't be afraid to ask, again, because otherwise it makes it difficult for both the lender, if applicable, and of course the closing attorney or settlement agent. For sellers, please take the names from the property appraiser's website, but also verify against their government-issued photo IDs. In some instances, you may need to use an AKA, also known as, again, as we will at the time of closing. I want you to specifically look at line 6 as we've added the words "as applicable" after the word "assigns." This is because of our new paragraph 26, which may now restrict what was previously a fully assignable contract, except where the seller is providing seller financing. Moving on to lines 20 through 22, we've now underlined the provision reminding both buyer and seller that spousal joinder is required for financing or selling a primary residence. On to paragraph 1, still on page 1, we did get rid of seller financing as an option apart from third-party financing. But per line 32 of the revised purchase and sale agreement, the contract now requires that financing type must be marked in paragraph 2. Paragraph 2, we've now added "or" between cash, loan without financing contingency, and loan with financing contingency. We'll now move on to page 2. Page 2, we've now cleaned up the verbiage in paragraph 2C and paragraph 2D, but there have been no substantive changes. However, in paragraph 2, commencing with line 82, we've now added to lines 84 and 85 the following: require that the appraisal or any other lender required valuations be ordered and obtained without delay. Of course, this does put the onus on the buyer to ensure that the buyer's lender does proceed accordingly. On lines 87 through 90, requires buyer to disclose loan status and specifically requires disclosure of appraisal status, whether the appraised value is less than the purchase price, and whether there are any lender required repairs, replacements, or treatments. Line 98 reflects that loan approval requires buyer and buyer's lender's receipt of the appraisal. The reason this has been done is in the past, again, we have many instances where the appraisal had not been obtained, but we had gotten to the end of the loan approval period. And of course, at that point, the buyer either needed to extend the loan approval period or had to make a decision as to whether to move forward without receipt of the appraisal. Lines 102 through 104 requires the buyer to provide seller with written evidence of loan denial if requested by the seller. And of course, indication as to whether or not the denial was due to the buyer's failure to provide necessary information, or basically due to the fact the buyer just could not obtain the required loan approval. Lines 107 through 112. Moving now into page 3. Lines 107 through 112 require that should the buyer elect to terminate the contract due to a low appraisal, this must be done within the loan approval period. Otherwise, the buyer is deemed to have elected to proceed to closing without regard to the appraised value. Moving on to paragraph 3, line 124. Added that an extension of the inspection period due to lack of access or utilities will not be less than 2 days. Otherwise, we are at a loss as to determine exactly how long, again, access had been denied. Remember, if the buyer does not terminate the contract or make a request for repairs, replacements, or treatments within the inspection period, the buyer is deemed to have accepted the property as is. Moving on to line 133, we added bulkhead, dock, boathouse, lift, and related equipment to possible items to be inspected. And on lines 144 and 145, just remember that paragraph 3 is for inspections and investigation, and that the buyer can terminate the contract for any, and I mean any reason within the inspection period. And of course, this should always be in writing. Moving on to page 4. Page 4, lines 169 through 171. Remember that the seller is not required to commence repairs, replacements, or treatments until in receipt of written notice of loan approval, of course, if applicable, which again requires receipt of the appraisal. Lines 179 through 181. Remember that if the buyer takes early occupancy, the buyer is responsible for all maintenance and repair not already agreed to be paid by the seller. Paragraph 4, line 183, we now have 5 days as the default as opposed to 10 as to when the title commitment is to be provided. That would be, again, 5 days prior to the date of closing. Moving on to lines 189 through 190, now requires the party paying for the municipal lien search to pay for it upon request by the settlement agent. There's no longer a time limit imposed because it's been taking much longer to obtain the municipal lien search. We want to make sure that's ordered as quickly as possible. Moving on to paragraph 5, survey map, line 191. If not stated, the default verbiage now requires that the survey be delivered at least 5 days prior to closing, as opposed to 10, as was the case in the previous contract. Paragraph 6, regardless of your choice for date of closing, just ensure that you allow approximately 15 days between the end of the loan approval period, if applicable, and the date of closing, as this should allow sufficient time to obtain the survey, municipal lien search, and any required homeowners association or condominium association estoppel letters without incurring these hard costs prior to the buyer obtaining loan approval. Having said this, and to be proactive, please consider ordering any required survey once under contract, as you could always use this survey as a copy for the next buyer if the contract buyer should elect to terminate the contract before closing. Also, please always remember that the bold verbiage on line 209 states that the date of closing may be extended by other conditions of the agreement. Page 5, moving on to page 5. Page 5, for paragraph 6B, lines 216 through 219, the extension of the date of closing due to CFPB delivery requirements has been shortened to 7 days, where previously it was 10, and now only applies if loan approval has been obtained by the buyer. Lines 219 through 221, we have widened the definition of force majeure. So please make sure that you do read through this carefully. And of course, we have incorporated now both endemics and pandemics based on the pandemic. Starting with line 229, the seller now directs the settlement agent upon receipt of the title commitment, survey, municipal lien search, and/or HOA, COA, again, the homeowners association or condominium association estoppel letter, to notify both buyer and seller of any potential defects, as this has been a problem, and we want to give the parties adequate time to resolve. There have been no material changes, again, to paragraph 7 or 8, moving now into page 6. Page 6, paragraph 9, prorations has now been updated to include flood insurance if assumed. The reason being, in some instances now, yes, flood insurance can be assumed by the buyer purchasing from the seller. Moving on to page 7. Page 7, paragraph 13, property disclosure. We've now added lines 371 through 373. This requires the seller to disclose if there have been repairs, improvements made to the property, either without proper permits or with permits that remain open or expired without the seller having closed them out. The seller is required to make a reasonable attempt to correct any building and zoning issues and to resolve any code enforcement issues. Moving on to page 8. This is a continuation of paragraph 13. I want you to remember again that pursuant to 13A, please do not forget to include a Florida energy efficiency rating brochure when presenting, again, a contract to any buyer. With regard to paragraph 13D, please do not forget to ensure that a community development district disclosure is signed by buyer and seller, if applicable, and made part of the contract itself. Paragraph 14, entitled Possession. Possession is presumed to be at the time of closing unless otherwise stated, and seller post-closing occupancy is presumed to be at no cost to the seller unless otherwise stated in paragraph 17. Any occupancy agreement should be prepared by legal counsel, again by legal counsel at the possessor's expense. And for any seller post-closing occupancy, the occupancy agreement should be prepared at least 5 days prior to the scheduled closing date. Continuing, all personal property must be removed by the time of buyer's possession, and the property must be left in broom swept clean condition by the time of buyer possession. This has become an issue because many sellers at the time or the date of closing have not yet removed all personal property. If that is the case, you would need to have a continuing asset access agreement. Otherwise, you will have an issue with the seller's personal property that has been left on the premises. Line 429, we have bolded, buyer understands that the property is available for rent or rented. In this regard, remember that any buyer takes subject to an existing tenancy and that there should be a transfer of any advance rents or security deposits. Moving on to page 9, paragraph 16, entitled Personal Property. Line 457, we've added television, wall mounts, and mounting hardware. As this was an issue, we had sellers who were removing both the mounts and the hardware, leaving gaping holes in the wall. And of course, buyers were not happy with this and wanted to know how the seller was going to make these repairs. So it was much easier to make this a standard provision under personal property. Line 458, we changed solar panels to solar equipment as we did not believe, again, the panels incorporate all the solar equipment. Line 459, we've added coverings to all window treatments as it was felt sometimes that treatments did not incorporate any window coverings. Line 467, we've added and security to other smart home devices, again, necessitating the deletion of security cameras. Paragraph 17, line 486, we've added backup addendum and have deleted the energy-related improvement assessment addendum. As this was used for PACE financing, we felt it did not, again, reflect, again, the norm within the industry. Moving on to page 10. Page 10, paragraph 18, entitled Complete Agreement and Miscellaneous Provisions, lines 503 through 504, added and initialed. So not only signed, but what? And initialed as appropriate there. Line 506, added excluding text messages. Same at line 514, as it was decided again by the Forms Committee and by the board that text messages may disappear over time and should not be relied upon. Paragraph 19, lines 518 through 519, we define federal holiday as a day on which a national legal public holiday is observed. That way we can leave again the term federal holiday throughout the remainder of the contract itself. Line 521, we changed the calendar day's end time back to 7 p.m. as opposed to 9 p.m. as again, it was agreed that the 7 p.m. cutoff was much more tenable than the 9 p.m. which we used in the prior version of the contract. Paragraph 22, Social Security numbers. Please remind both buyers and sellers that they have agreed to provide their Social Security numbers or the tax identification numbers to the settlement agent upon request. And of course, these can be provided in person or by secure email. Again, moving on to page 11, paragraph 25, lines 541 through 543, Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. Any seller who is not a U.S. citizen or a resident alien is required to advise the settlement agent of this fact within 10 days after the date of contract acceptance. We've also added again that the seller will pay all costs associated with both withholding and reporting to the IRS. The reason being, unbeknownst to most people again, FERPA actually puts the onus on the buyer to ensure that the seller complies. Therefore, we wanted to make sure that even though the onus may be on the buyer, that the cost would actually be that of the seller. There are exceptions to the withholding requirements if the purchase price does not exceed $300,000 and the buyer is willing to sign an affidavit that he or she intends to occupy the property for the majority of each of the 2 years following closing. Otherwise, the seller would be required to remit 10 to 15% of the gross sales price, not the net proceeds, but the gross sales price to the IRS, pending a determination of any tax due on the sale. We also added paragraph 26, lines 544 through 548, assignability. Now, the buyer may assign the contract and be released from liability, or assign the contract and not be released from liability. Now, this has always been the practice presumption based on past versions of our contract, unless, of course, the seller has agreed to provide seller financing for a specific buyer. And will still be the default verbiage if no box is checked. However, again, under the new version of the contract, the buyer may not assign the contract if so required by checking the appropriate box. Time of acceptance is now paragraph 27 as opposed to paragraph 26. And date of acceptance is now paragraph 28 as opposed to paragraph 27. For date of acceptance, please remember that this date is the date that the contract and all marked addenda, riders, and disclosures have been executed by both buyer and seller and delivered to buyer and seller or their respective brokers. Lines 558 through 569. Marital status has been added beneath both buyer and seller signature lines. One of the reasons for this is we did delete it again from the introductory paragraph of the contract. So we felt, again, this would be an appropriate place, again, to indicate marital status. But again, please, when writing a contract, do indicate if a couple is a married couple, whether the buyers intend to take title as joint tenants with right of survivorship or tenants in common. And again, from a seller's perspective, please ensure, again, that if the seller is married, that you indicate as such, and of course, whether or not the property is the seller's primary residence. Because if so, once again, the seller's spouse will be required to join on the deed at the time of the closing. Line 571 now only requires completion and broker's signature if a binder deposit is paid with the offer. As we're finding, most buyers are wanting to pay the binder deposit typically within 3 days after the date of contract acceptance. Moving on to page 12. Page 12 states, of course, broker only joining in to be bound by the provisions of paragraph 12 governing binder dispute, waiver of jury trial and attorney's fees, and of course, paragraph 18 acknowledging that this is a complete agreement. Of course, all notice and modification requirements, that the contract will not be recorded or any memorandum thereof, requiring good faith and fairness, and that notice to or from a broker equates to notice to or from a seller. This is very important to remember, okay? So once again, when notice is required to be given to buyer or seller, that notice can now be given again to the broker for that party, and that equates to notice to buyer or seller. And again, in the same token, notice from a buyer or seller can also be given through that broker. This does conclude the modifications to the NEFAR purchase and sale agreement. I will now move on to a few of the addenda with some pretty significant changes. First, the appraisal addenda. The buyer must provide seller with written evidence of the appraised value immediately upon receipt thereof. The buyer still agrees to pay up to a certain dollar amount over the appraised value, not to exceed, of course, the original purchase price. The buyer is required to pay any cash differential from buyer's funds and makes a representation that these funds are available to the buyer. It also clarifies that the seller is not required to sell at a reduced purchase price, but requires the seller to give notice if not, with buyer then having 3 days to terminate the contract or be deemed to proceed at the original purchase price. Next is the condominium rider. We've added again to paragraph 4 that seller represents that seller is not aware of any special or other assessment that has been levied by the association, or that has been an item on the agenda or reported in the minutes of the association within 6 months prior to the effective date of the contract. Paragraph 9, we've edited so that buyers specifically request a current copy of the declaration of condominium, articles of incorporation, bylaws, rules of the association, the question and answer document, and the most recent year-end financial information. Of course, this is all statutory. Next is the escalatory addendum, which has been completely rewritten. It provides that buyer is willing to pay an amount referred to as the escalation amount over and above the purchase price in any bona fide competitive offer, not to exceed a maximum purchase price, which is then defined as such, the maximum purchase price. It also goes on to state that if the bona fide offer being used contains an escalation amount, you would add that escalation amount to the purchase price in that offer, to which you would then also add your escalation amount to determine the revised purchase price. The escalation amount can either be added to the cash balance due at closing, the loan amount, or sum to each. The intent was not to have the highest offer bidding against itself, but to give other offers the ability to better that offer by offering the escalation amount over that purchase price up to a maximum purchase price. Please ensure that when computing the revised purchase price, that you are using only the purchase price in the offers presented and not the maximum purchase price. If in doubt as to how to compute, you may be better off using a multiple offer notice, requesting highest and best, or alternatively, countering any one offer with terms most acceptable to the seller. For your benefit, we have included a safeguard for you as the agent, in that the seller is required to state what the revised purchase price is, with the buyer then required to agree to this purchase price by affixing the buyer's signature. Next, we have the notice of termination of purchase and sale agreement and mutual agreement to cancel purchase and sale agreement and release of deposit. We've added, if applicable, following the reason for termination, as this form is meant to be used as both a notice of termination and or a mutual agreement to cancel. In other words, a notice of termination can be given without an agreement to cancel and vice versa. Finally, we have the seller financing addendum, to which we have added, the mortgage will or will not permit further encumbrance of the property, as we have found in many instances, again, that a seller who agrees to hold paper does not want to have to incorporate a defendant again, who may be holding a lesser mortgage in the event foreclosure becomes necessary. Thank you so much for your time.